Hello, everyone, and welcome to YouTube channel War and Politics. My name is Sofia Troshchuk, and it's my pleasure to introduce our guest. It's Dr. Yuri Felshtinsky, Russian-American historian. Dr. Felshtinsky, hello, nice to see you, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for your time.
So, today we will have a slightly unusual conversation based on the books of Dr. Felshtinsky. We will talk about the history of Russia and more about Putin, how a former intelligence officer became a threat to the whole world. And I want to start with the role of the Secret Service FSB in Putin's becoming president. The way you tell the story in the history of Russia's secret services, from red terror to terrorist state, former KGB operative Putin was on the bottom of the list of names who would be allowed to succeed Boris Yeltsin as president. There was Primakov, who was the former director of the SVR, Foreign Intelligence Service. There was Stepashin, who was a former director of the FSK, another incarnation of FSB before its name was changed. And then there was Putin. Why him? Why Putin?
Well, unlike traditional politicians, and this relates to people like Lenin, Hitler, Stalin, even Khrushchev and Brezhnev, Putin was never fighting for political power. He was not a politician, and he probably in his dreams even never was planning to be head of the Russian state. This all happened because by 1999, and the story is very long, and it started in 1917, 1918, when Felix Dzerzhinsky, the first uh, secretary of the PCK, future KGB, became chairman and was dreaming about taking control of the Russian state. So the story is long. This is not this is not suddenly the FSB, the former KGB, made a decision to take control of the Russian state. They were dreaming about this for 100 years, but by 1999, Yeltsin became so weak and so much surrounded by the former KGB, the FSB, that he at one point realized that he's ready to give this power to the state security. And uh, the concern was Yeltsin's concern was that he's weak and he's going to step down. He's about to be replaced, and that the new leader would not secure his personal freedom and the freedom of his family, because there were a lot of people. There's a long line of people who would love to see Yeltsin in prison and his family in prison for corruption. Again, corruption is a common phenomenon in Russia, and let's put it this way: any person who was involved in private business could be put in prison in Russia if you apply strictly laws to that particular person. So the law enforcement was very selective, always very selective in Russia. So Democrats wanted to put Yeltsin in prison for committing crimes during the first Chechen war, for example, and conservatives or communists wanted to put Yeltsin and his family in prison for the corruption and privatization, for example, of the Russian economy, which was conducted a very corrupt way. So Yeltsin was very nervous about this, and somehow KGB, the state security, basically promised him that if a representative of the state security would become president of Russia, then they guarantee that he will die in his bed and his family will never be touched. And Yeltsin believed them. and he was right. We know now that he was right to believe them. And all candidates which were submitted to him were from the state security. Primakov, former director of the Foreign Intelligence Service, Stepashin, former director of the FSB. Those days, the name of the FSB was FSK. And Putin was the last one. Now, Primakov, Yeltsin did not like him because he kind of was very rude to Yeltsin. He basically didn't respect him from the moment he became prime minister, because the plan was very simple. By law, by constitution, if something happens to president, then prime minister becomes active president and organizes new elections. Now, in Russia, which was a very young democracy, let's put it this way, because democracy, in Russia was established only in 1991, right? It was clear that elections could be manipulated, and this was actually done so in 1996 when Yeltsin became president through elections of 1996. They were manipulated, and so people who were in charge of Russia knew that it's very easy to manipulate presidential elections. So if you already have your person as acting president of Russia, basically you have your president. And so Yeltsin did not like Primakov. Yeltsin did not trust Stepashin. He didn't trust Primakov for the same reason he didn't trust Stepashin. He was not sure that they sincerely would try to guarantee the immunity of his family and himself. And somehow, again, Putin was last in the line, and Yeltsin somehow trusted him. And again, from this point of view, he happened to be the choice was the correct one. Yeltsin and his family has immunity. And even now, no one is even trying to touch his family. They are safe and living comfortable, nice life, partially abroad, let's say, or everybody is abroad by now, but nevertheless, no one is touching them. And so Putin became president as a representative of the FSB. He knew this. He knew that he became president not because his own political ambitions or his own political fighting for power, but because basically they moved him, the FSB, the leaders of the FSB moved him to the position of president of Russia. And he's serving as president of Russia on behalf of the FSB. Now, of course, with time, and he's in power for 25 years by now, he became more and more and more powerful. And all his assistants or comrades who are now working for him as part of the presidential administration, mainly also from the FSB. These are two structures which rule Russia. One rules openly and officially. It's the presidential administration, which again includes many FSB officers, and then the FSB as a state security. So these are just two structures which exist in Russia as powerful institution. The rest does not really matter. The cabinet of ministers, for example, is not important from this point of view. They do not have actually power. The Security Council exists, but again, it has no power. Russian Duma has no power at all. This is the only parliament in the world which does not fight for power at all. They fight for seats in the parliament because it's very profitable, but they do not really compete for power with Kremlin. So there is no competition, there is no opposition. all opposition is destroyed. Mainly, it was forced to leave Russia, and they are abroad. Some people were killed, like Boris Nemtsov, like Alexei Navalny. Some people were put in prison, but mainly they were pushed out of Russia. So there is no competition. There are no elections. I mean, there are elections, but they are like elections in the Soviet Union when everything was predictable and there were no real elections. And again, the political opposition, there's few brave people, probably so brave that they choose to spend time in prison for their beliefs, but mainly everybody who wanted and was able to emigrated. There is no pressure on Putin. There is no reason for him to step down because the FSB is very happy with the results. As a result of these operations, brilliant operation of 2000, they took control of the Russian state. Finally, right after really almost 100 years of fighting for this, they took control of the Russian state, and basically forever. They're not planning to give it away, this power and this control. And I think they're quite happy with the result, and they're not going to replace Putin unless there is a reason to stop the war. But so far, they really do not have any pressure to stop this war, and I think they are quite comfortable with the format the war is taken. It's so-called permanent war, when on the ground it's positional war, like during the First World War, for example, and this kind of war could continue forever. And really they do not have any pressure, any reasons to stop it. I think they feel quite comfortable with the way the war is going on. They could not achieve the victory, this is true. They were dreaming, of course, about taking Ukraine and proceeding into Europe. This does not work so far, but for them, this is just a matter of time.
Putin came to power against the backdrop of the war in Chechnya, you mentioned. What was it like from within Russian society? Who did Putin appear to be at that time?
Well, the important question is why the first Chechen war and then the second Chechen war was started. And we usually intend to believe that both wars started because Chechens wanted to have independence from the Russian state, and the Russian government were forced to conduct this war to hold Chechnya or Chechen Republic within the Russian Federation. This is probably not so, because Chechens, of course, would like to have their independence, but they were not planning actually to separate from the Russian Federation. This was not their intention. And that's probably not why the war in the Chechen Republic, the first Chechen war, happened. It probably happened because the Russian government, again, partially at that point controlled by the FSB, and we are talking about General Alexander Korzhakov, who was in charge of the security of Boris Yeltsin, but in reality was probably the person who was ruling Russia those years, was planning to replace replace Yeltsin with one of his friends, who, to have a certain coup d'etat, similar to the one which happened on 31st of December 1999, when Yeltsin resigned and Putin was named prime minister and named acting president of Russia. So something similar Korzhakov was planning to do in March of '96. When presidential elections were coming. And in case this plan would not work and he would have to cancel elections or to postpone them, they needed the reason for this. And they decided this good reason could be a war with the Chechen Republic. And they orchestrated this war. They actually provoked Chechens to start military activity against the Russian troops, which moved into the Chechen Republic and specifically into capital of the Chechen Republic, Grozny. So the war was provoked. It started. It became very bloody. Russian troops were not doing well. And in March '96, Korzhakov actually proposed to Yeltsin that they would cancel or postpone elections due to the war in the Chechen Republic. Now, this was happening because Yeltsin became extremely unpopular by March of '96 and had like 2 or 3% of popular support. He could not win elections, and his communist opponent Zyuganov had good chances to win. And that's why this decision was made to postpone the elections or to cancel this altogether. We do not really know because the decree was signed, but it was never published. It was never published because Yeltsin's daughter Tatiana, who was technically speaking consultant to Yeltsin, found out about this decree, released information to very powerful politicians and democratic politicians like Anatoly Chubais, who released in turn this information to the business community. People like Boris Berezovsky, who knew quite well that if Korzhakov postpone elections and Putin and Yeltsin, would rule by decree, this would lead to a dictatorship in Russia, and Korzhakov simply would take all the money and all the businesses, and they could not resist this. So they basically approached Yeltsin through Tatiana Dyachenko, and Yeltsin agreed not to postpone elections, to go through to take a chance to go through campaign. He fired Korzhakov, Barsukov, who was Michael Barsukov, who was in charge of the Ministry of Security. Those days, the FSB had the name Ministry of Security. Who also fired Siskovets, who was planned to become was planning to become the next president of Russia, and went through elections. So he won. But again, the elections were manipulated. And 3 years later, basically the FSB repeated the same operation, right? And for this, they needed the second Chechen. Very simple, because in '99 they were facing the same problem. What would happen if this doesn't work for one or another reason? What if we have to postpone elections or to cancel elections? We need to have a reason. So why don't we, we are not going to be creative. We will do what we've done in '95 prior to elections of 1996. We will have another war with the Chechen Republic. But in order to have this war, you need to provoke this, right? So you have to have a reason to declare war against the Chechen Republic. Now, not too many people remember that the first Chechen war started with the terrorist acts in Moscow. I mean, those days, people were not so cynical. So these were comparatively small terrorist acts. And those days, what is very important, this is the end of '94, this was militia, Ministry of Internal Affairs, who would investigate terrorist acts in Russia. So militia was doing a great job. They arrested all terrorists, and all of them happened to be from the state security. all of them. They were sentenced. They were sentenced for crimes unrelated to terrorism, like illegal possession of weapons, forge of documents, because of course, some of them were saying that they're not members of the security and the documents were forged. The FSB stated that the documents were forged. They were not. This was a group of very famous, actually, state security operative Max Lazovsky, and they were sentenced, and they were then released by the decision of the Supreme Court of Russia, which was a very rare case. The involvement of Supreme Court in case like this in Russia was extremely rare, and they were quietly released. And by August of '99, by the way, all of them were out of prison. So it's we do not really know who precisely was involved in September '99 terrorist acts, but the Lazovsky group was out of prison by that time. So, as we know, they started the war. As we know, they had elections, and Putin won. Again, the elections were manipulated, as well as they were in 1996. And Putin received like 52%, something like this, if I'm correct, and became president of Russia. So that's how this was done. And as soon as the elections were over and Putin became president, they installed Kadyrov in the Chechen Republic. First Kadyrov father, then Kadyrov son, and through this they created a puppet government in the Chechen Republic, and Kadyrov basically guaranteed to Putin that Chechnya will be under his control, and this was effectively done. That's how it is so, and the same was done in Belarus, where Lukashenko basically controlled Belarus on behalf of Putin, and they were trying to do the same in Ukraine with Yanukovych, but it didn't work, as we know. In Ukraine, Ukraine revolted and took Yanukovych down. But for example, in Georgia, it still works. The Russian government effectively controls the government of Georgia, although the entire population is against its government, but Russia managed to control the government. It's important. They made several attempts to create puppet government in Moldova. It didn't work, but again they were trying. So they basically try to create puppet governments in all those former Soviet republics which are staying independent, and sometimes they succeed, sometimes they do not.
When did it become clear that Putin is not the choice of the Russians in the democratic sense, but a protege of the FSB who will rule for such a long time?
Well, to be fair, to majority of Russians, it is not clear at all, and even to probably to majority of those people who left Russia, meaning to those people who are against the war and do not like Putin and do not agree with Putin, not everyone looks at him as the representative of the FSB who came to power in 2000. Majority of people thought that he was, installed by oligarchs, people like Abramovich and Berezovsky. And this was partially true. They supported his candidacy, but actually almost all oligarchs supported his candidacy. There was no open opposition from oligarchs' side to oppose presidency of Putin. everybody saw that the fact that he is from the KGB, and of course everybody knew that he was in charge of the FSB right before he became prime minister and then quickly the president. But everybody saw that this is kind of irrelevant, that, well, in every country you have the state security, so who cares? What's important that he is young and probably progressive and probably business oriented, and he was involved in business in St. Petersburg, and many oligarchs knew him from those years when he was in charge of business. So there were no opposition to Putin, and no one thought that the fact that Putin was from KGB originally and was director of the FSB, that it doesn't that this is important, and this is a major mistake. Of course, this was a major mistake, but even now, it's not like everybody understands suddenly that this is the FSB which rules Russia. No, that's not how majority of people look at the situation. I'm in minority. I have to tell you, I'm a minority, right? I belong to a minority. Uh, some, Sometimes I'm the only person who makes certain conclusions, right, in connection with Putin and the FSB. But I do not see Putin as a dictator even now. I think that he rules on behalf of the FSB. And I think that as long as he has support of the FSB, he is safe, and no one would try to take him down, because there is no one else has power to take him down. Right? There is no opposition, and there are no armed structures except the FSB and the army. But army traditionally in Russia never played any political role, so we should not expect the army to revolt against Putin. This will never happen. So I think as long as the FSB is supporting him, he is safe, and nothing is going to take him down, right? If something happens, and for one or another reason, the FSB would understand that they need to change something in the behavior of the Russian state, like, for example, finish the war, stop the war with Ukraine, finish the war with Ukraine, then it might be possible that they would have to remove Putin, because Putin is the last person who will sign anything if we're talking about the end of the war. Then they would have to replace him, but or he will step down. I do not know how this will be organized, but unless Russia wants to stop the war, I think Putin is not going to retire, or to leave politics, or to die, or disappear. So the question is how to create conditions when Russia is interested to stop this war. And unfortunately, they do not care about victims of this war, not just in Ukraine, but also in Russia. They do not really care how many people are killed. They do not really care how much it costs, because they have still enough raw materials to sell to the world market economy, and they will buy it, maybe not for the best prices, but still this money is enough. The same relates to weapons. It might be not the best weapons, but again, they have enough. Ukraine is much smaller, of course, and Ukraine is not getting all the help they need. Ukraine is getting some help, but not as much as necessary. So they're conducting this permanent war, and they could conduct it literally forever. If we remember that the war started in 2014, then actually it's going for its 12th year now. if it you know, if it's going to continue until like January, then this war will be longer than the Great Patriotic War of the Soviet Union, 1941 to 1945. So there is nothing indicates that Russia is willing to stop this war, unless, and I think this is a possibility and a chance, unless Ukrainians will start to attack Moscow. And it's not by chance Putin is attacking Kiev like every other day or every day, because he knows that capital is important. Capital is always important, but in case of Russia, this is the only weakest point and the most important, part of the state, because the entire Russian state is actually just Moscow. And what's happening in Moscow is important, and what's happening outside Moscow is irrelevant. This is not, again, this is not in every country, but that's a very specific issue of Russia. It's a country of one city. So unless Ukrainians start to attack Moscow, the Russian government, and this is Putin and the FSB leadership and all those people who are somehow related to the governing of Russia, Russian government would not have any reasons to consider the stopping of this war.
In your opinion, how have relations between Russia and Ukraine changed during Putin's rule in Russia? Did he always want to take over Ukraine, or was there such a turning point?
Well, we know that Putin mentioned later, this happened after, of course, he invaded Crimea, that he considers the dissolution of the Soviet Union a geopolitical catastrophe and his personal tragedy. And this, I think, is how he looked at the event. And again, his views were not unique. You could probably talk to Russians, and probably every second of them, or maybe even more, would tell you that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a catastrophe. That this is something with what they had. The Soviet Union, a major, superpower, and somehow it collapsed, and several states were created. And well, by the way, some of those states, I mean, they're so small and so unimportant that it's actually, I mean, it's a laughing story to recognize them as states. Look at the Baltic states, for example. They're very small and they are not able to exist independently. Look at the Ukraine, this language doesn't exist, this nation doesn't exist, this was always part of Russia. And look at Belarus, etc., etc., etc. So Russians intended to believe that they are great Russians, not just Russians, they're great Russians. And because they're great Russians, and this goes back to the Russian Empire, of course, when this was a huge Russian Empire even before 1917. So they have the authority to rule over other nations. Unfortunately, this belief is very deep, and this belief was always the case before revolution and after revolution, that somehow Russia is very different and Russians are very different from all other nations. And for this reason, they have the right to do things which other nations do not do, or do not want to do, or do not have the right to do. And this is the main problem. It's a philosophical one, of course, but that's the main one. And so for Russia, Ukraine was never an obvious independent state or independent territory. not speaking to the fact that there were a lot of Russians living in Ukraine, and that's why all elections in Ukraine prior to 2014 were actually, coming with 50-50 results. I mean, it was very difficult to figure out which half won. The pro-Russian part, which wanted to be oriented towards Russia, or pro-Western part, which was oriented towards being part of Europe and European Union. Again, this changed in 2014, of course, because in 2014, instead of moving from Belarus into Kiev, what was done in 22, by the way, stupid Russians sent Russian tanks, to take control of eastern Ukraine, which actually was pro-Russian. But before Russia moved their tanks to destroy everything in eastern Ukraine as well. And that's the result of this. Of course, Russia took control of Crimea. But as a result of this, even those Russians who were living in eastern Ukraine and were pro-Russian became anti-Russian now. But this was as a result of 2014 war. And then, of course, by 22, in 22, when Russia invaded Ukraine from Belarus, the situation dramatically changed. And by now, in Ukraine, Russian books are not published, for example, at all, as a retaliation against Russia, and the Ukraine became extremely anti-Russian. So I do not really think that Ukraine will ever become, not even pro-Russian, but neutral to Russia. I think it's impossible. I think this would continue for dozens of years. But for Putin, Ukraine was the first territory. Well, not the first one. Again, he already had Belarus under his control because Lukashenko was a representative of the puppet Russian government. He controlled Chechnya. He controlled basically Georgia. They invaded Georgia in 2008. Withdrew, took some territories from Georgia, but did not try to occupy entire Georgia. Instead, they were, working to overthrow the Georgian government, and they successfully did so, and they have pro-Russian government now. So it's not that the Ukraine was the first territory which Russia was planning to take. We even could say that Ukraine was the last one, and it happened to be the most difficult task for Putin. He still is not able to take it. He was trying to take it through Anschluss kind of attack in 2014. He could not. He took Crimea, but again in Crimea, Russian troops were staying since Soviet years under the agreement with the Ukrainian government, and Ukraine had no troops at all, not just in Crimea. Basically, Ukraine had no troops. I mean, whom should they be afraid of? Russia? Ha ha ha. They would never. I mean, this is kind of friendly territory. Besides, Ukraine had this Budapest Memorandum, according to which they gave up nuclear weapons in exchange for security guarantees from major powers, which included both Russia and United States. So then they were trying to have a kind of blitzkrieg operation against Ukraine in February 22. They failed. Then they tried to. So then, of course, the campaign of 25 was based on the idea that Trump will force Ukraine to capitulate, will stop the assistance, what he did, and will force Ukraine to capitulate. This didn't work. So now Putin has actually, using Trump's rhetoric, has no cards at all. There is nothing what he can do. He could bombard cities, what he does. But if Ukraine is not surrendering, he is not able to take it actually. So we will see what's going to happen. One possibility is that he will escalate, and when we see he will escalate against other states, and when we see those drones flying over Poland or Estonia, then this might be that they're testing waters to see how the West would react. And what they see so far that NATO does not react as NATO, that the Americans are, of course, are not going to be involved. Then Trump is not going to help Europe. This they already know. Now they have to decide whether they would risk invasion. I think the exercises, so-called military exercises, which they conducted in Belarus recently, failed completely. Initially, Russia was planning to move troops for serious exercises in Belarus, and this probably, or this might end with invasion of Eastern Europe. But at the end, they decided not to do this, and in the Russian press, they were saying that like 100,000 Russian troops were participating in military exercises in Belarus. The Western calculations are that 13,000 people were participating in those exercises, and 10,000 people actually were Belarusians and just 3,000 Russians. So basically, they decided not to risk the invasion, at this time at least. And so we will see where this would go. But again, I'm afraid that unless uh, Ukrainians have ability to strike against Moscow, nothing will change.
Dr. Felshtinsky, thank you for this conversation and thank you for your time.
Thank you for your time. Thanks a
Actually,
lot.
I want to just to tell that today we believe in Ukrainian defense forces, and we know that they really have some influence on FSB and Putin's plans connected with Ukraine.
Well, as new Chancellor of Germany, Merz mentioned last time in Washington, D.C., when they had this famous meeting with Trump and Zelensky and all other leading European politicians, when they discuss Ukrainian guarantees, he said the best guarantee Ukraine might have is the Ukrainian army, and that's what it is. I mean, unfortunately or unfortunately, this is the only real guarantee Ukraine has, because not just Ukraine has, I have to say Europe has, because the Ukrainian army is the only real army in Europe which is standing against the Russian aggression. There are some capable countries, motivated countries like Poland, the Baltic states, Finland, Sweden. It's not that they're not going to fight. If something happens, they will fight. But so far, the only army with real military experience is the Ukrainian army. And that's how it is, and that's why Europe should help and is helping Ukraine and Ukrainian army, because this is their guarantee against the Russian invasion.
I totally agree. And dear our viewers, if this conversation was useful to you, like and share and leave your questions in the comments. We will try to answer them later. So, Dr. Felshtinsky, thank you one more time.
Thanks again.
And see you.